Yeah, untreated. They don't have to treat it. San Francisco, New York City.
Southern California Special Committee on Bay Delta, Tuesday, June 27th, 2017. I'll call the meeting to order. This is the opportunity for members of the public to address the committee on matters within the committee's jurisdiction. Do any members of the public wish to speak? I have no cards. So seeing none, moving right along. We'll continue to item 2, approval of the minutes from the meetings on April 25th and May 20th. Sorry.
Yes. On the minutes, are you going to take them together? Because I'd like to abstain from April because I wasn't present.
Okay, we'll separate them. Going for the minutes on April 25th, 2017, do I have a motion for acceptance?
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second for April 17th, 25th. Can you do that? We're going to do just the 25th first and then the May. Okay, vote. Okay, we have approval. So we'll move on to the minutes of May 23rd, 2017. I have a motion for acceptance.
So moved.
We have a motion and a second. We'll wait until it comes up. Can you do May 23rd alone?
We understand. It's May.
All right, let's just do the vote.
Just vote.
Just vote. I did. Well, sorry, thought I did. Okay, we've accepted the minutes. Let's go on. We're now going to hear committee item 3A. This will be a science briefing on longfin smelt studies by Sean Acuna, Senior Research Specialist from our Sacramento office. This is a tremendous piece of work. We had an early presentation to the chair and the vice chair, and the science that went in this is really incredible. I'd like to ask Roger to do the introduction.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. Good morning. Sean Acuna works in our Bay Delta shop up in Sacramento. He's been with Met for about 3.5 years. He's a PhD in ecology. He came to us from UC Davis. He does a lot of work on multiple stressor kinds of issues in the Delta. Sean's really an expert on both Delta smelt and longfin smelt. And what I like about Sean is he's practical. For a PhD biologist, he's incredibly practical, and he actually looks at every little detail of every little bit of money he spends, and he comes in and he goes, this is why I think we ought to do this. So he's fantastic, and I really appreciate the chance to work with him on these issues. And Sean, it's all yours.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Chairman and the chair of the committee and vice chair of the committee for letting me speak here today with you. I'm going to be talking about longfin smelt research. And let me go to the next slide real quick. So we have a number of briefings that we've done on research and our activities in the Bay Delta initiatives. This is our latest one on longfin research. And some of the discussion topics I want to talk about here are a little bit of background on life history. I'll try not to bore you too much on that. And then move on to management relevance, as well as work with what we're going to do in our research innovations and our next steps, including for next July's board letter. So a little bit on the longfin smelt life history. They have a pretty wide distribution, actually, from Alaska all the way down to California. They can live in the ocean along the shoreline, and they are known in these, where these arrows are pointing out, these are known estuaries where they can be found. The southernmost portion can be found in the San Francisco Bay Delta. And they're known to be able to breed in both the fresh and brackish water, so the lower salinity water, in the San Francisco Bay Delta. Why is it important to know all this information about the longfin smelt? They're pretty small fish, so you're just wondering why is there such a big impact? Because they are a state-listed fish, 2009. They're also going to be, they're in a kind of a holding pattern when it comes to the federal listing. They're warranted but precluded because there's kind of a backlog there. But they are set up to be listed in federal, so ESA, the Endangered Species Act. Some of the actions that have been promoted to help with the longfin smelt are outflow management, so from the delta, that's the upstream flows. Reducing entrainment through the diversion, so if the fish are being entrained into the pumps, there's steps to try and reduce that, as well as habitat restoration. The dominant flow action that has been promoted for the most part has been outflow. Now, for the extent of longfin smelt, we know that they're based on a survey, several surveys. These are as annual surveys that have been compounded from 94 to 2008, showing the densities of breeding adult longfin smelt in the Bay Delta. So you can see the San Francisco Bay here, Sassoon Bay here, and then here's the Delta, where we have the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. The darker circles are increased percent catch in the trawl data, showing that they are widely distributed throughout the habitat, and they can also be found in the ocean as well. So when we're talking about delta outflow is from this delta, all the flow that's coming from, mostly from these two major rivers, the San Joaquin and Sacramento, coming out through here. As you go from east to west, that effect will be will lower, and then we have these other tributaries. The current status of longfin smelt is pretty low based on a lot of these surveys that we have out there, where there's some initial high periods, but more recently, very low numbers, which has given us a lot of concern. A lot of fisheries biologists are very concerned about that, and that's why management and the listings have been promoted. So why did I talk about flow recently, just in a couple of slides before? It's because there is a flow abundance relationship. So this is the abundance on the left, and then you have the flow here on the bottom. This is a log scale. And we can see is that, and such as in this pattern, that as you increase the flow, there's a positive relationship with abundance. This is the pre-clam area. So there's a recent invasion, 1998, they've felt that this invasion of these clams has actually caused a step decline. Well, now you have this other pattern where the flow, you actually have a lower response with abundance. And more recent period, the pelagic organism declined, where a number of fish that are in the pelagic regions, so the upper water column of the area, has also had this sort of step decline, where the relationship is low again. So for the same amount of water, for 20,000 cubic feet per second of water, you go up there to the pre-clam times, and you get roughly about 3,000 for the index. When you, more recently, you get about 100, so a many-fold decrease in that relationship. So what are we really interested in when it comes to this relationship is why are we seeing that step change? What is the relationship governing the abundance and flow relationship, and what factors may be contributing to that decline? This is a recent publication, 2016, showing a heat map of salinity. So the darker, the reddish color is more like the ocean. That's how salty it is. This is 2008, which is a dry year, and 1998, which is an example of a wet year. And you can see that this salinity field, where you have more fresher water in blue, and then the saltier water in the orange to red, that you see a lot more blue in the higher flow years than you do in the low flow years. But one thing we want to point out is that although we do have this really strong, relatively higher flows from the delta, there's all these other endpoints that we get flow from. And even in dry years, you still get a modest flow within some of the other areas as well. And you can see that in this sort of contour, there's flow influences from Petaluma, from Sonoma, and Napa, also affecting the salinity field, not just delta outflow. And then you can see here down here in Coyote Creek. We've done a lot of sampling out there. A colleague of mine, Lenny Grimaldo, has done a lot of sampling out in Suisun Bay. And we also have the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's routine monitoring looking for larvae, as well as another researcher, Dr. Jim Hobbs at UC Davis, looking for longfin. And here's an example of this year's sampling. And what we've been seeing over the years of sampling from 2013, 2014, we're starting to see this here as well in 2017, is that spawning seems to be happening in brackish water. This is important because a large portion of what was believed of the spawning was happening in freshwater, so upstream, these areas, directly influenced by delta outflow. The more brackish water, the areas around more westward, that influence is much lower. There's still going to be an influence, but it's much lower. So in 2017, we see that in this high flow years, that this habitat is barely occupied here. This is more fresher water, and then you can see in Napa quite a bit. But as I mentioned before, this whole San Francisco Bay right here is not covered by this survey. So with work from Jim Hobbs and Lenny Grimaldo, we were able to cover this area and found there was spawning there as well. In fact, this year, they found spawning out in the South Bay, which was believed to be unlikely, highly unlikely, but there was definitely spawning happening down there in the South Bay of the San Francisco Bay. And there was a recent publication by Lenny in 2017. So what are the potential flow abundance mechanisms that we have on for longfin smelt? Well, it could be habitat. And we believe it's a habitat that is sort of like sweetening up where the saltier waters become a little bit fresher, allowing for longfin to be able to occupy those areas. And one of those areas is some of our investments in restoration, such as Tule Red. That's one of them. And habitat in San Francisco Bay. Restoration in San Francisco Bay is ongoing and continues, and there's more to happen. But we feel that there's a lot more influence of local tributaries that are affecting those habitats. And that's habitat that's not being assessed as well as the upstream habitat for longfin smelt. So it needs to be highlighted and elevated in the San Francisco Bay that longfin smelt is using that habitat fairly extensively, and it's very important. Most of the habitat is being managed for more saltwater species, those kind of things, while longfin is more of an estuarine. So I'm going to change gears just a little bit, look at the abundance trends. This sort of decline in the abundance. What is explaining a lot of this decline? Well, for starters, of course, there are a lot less fish out there. That's for sure. What we're seeing. We're seeing this sort of trend that seems to be affecting that abundance. So there definitely seems to be less, but that makes sense because more recently there's been a lot of dry years, and therefore we would expect to be lower numbers of fish in the delta. Now, I did mention that they're also in the ocean, so it doesn't mean that the overall abundance has reduced. It just means at least the abundance in the San Francisco Bay estuary has reduced. They could have gone out the ocean. It's possible. Now, looking at these trawl data, for data that goes from the San Francisco Bay all the way into the lower confluence of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers, we have these two trawls that go sequentially with each other. We have the otter trawl and the midwater trawl. I'm going to go over a little bit more on specifically their differences, but basically we do see this decline, but in the midwater trawl, that decline is much greater. So what's the difference between these two trawls? Well, longfin smelt we know tends to be a little bit more bottom oriented. So along the bottom, they're generally around here. The otter trawl is along the bottom, while the midwater trawl goes diagonally along the water column. And that's an important trawl to have because you want to know what the fish are doing along that gradient, these different layers of the water. But what happens is that if the longfin smelt are more bottom oriented, that midwater trawl tends to only hit them at a lower point. Not only that, so there's water clarity issues. If it's clear water, that's been shown that in other estuaries and other fishery surveys that if the water is clear, fish can detect the trawls and avoid them. So there's actually been found that there's an increased clarity in the San Francisco Bay area. That's been ongoing, and it's going to be maybe considered a more increasing problem as sediment loads are reducing. Depth has been increasing in some of the stations. We're not sure why that is. Maybe because shift in stations, maybe because there's less sediment load, there's not as much depth in those stations. But basically, we are seeing sort of this relationship that the reason why the midwater trawl and the otter trawl are diverging in how bad they're kind of showing the decline is that it's likely that it could be correlated with this water clarity and depth. And so we want to do a study to look at that. So what explains this catch? Obviously the decrease in abundance. For the benthic trawl itself, there are a decrease in abundance and maybe shift in distribution. For the benthic trawl, it looks like water clarity and station depth has had a significant effect. So we're going to be taking a look at that. So our next steps in our research is working with a lot of different research partners, state and federal, as well as our consultants and research institutes such as San Francisco State University and UC Davis. We're using genetic analysis to understand the population of the longfin smelt. Are they exchanging with those upper populations? Are they a distinct population? Life history is going to be examined using a lot of fancy chemistry to try to figure out exactly where they are. And that is helpful because if we can figure out where they're coming from, if they're coming from the Napa or they're coming from upstream in Suisun Bay, habitat restoration can be localized to those areas. As well as looking at distribution, we're going to be looking with our partners on distribution as well. And that's sort of that, looking at that trawl data, looking at why that trawl data seems to correlate with depth and water clarity. That's just correlation data. It doesn't mean that it's actually happening. So we want to go out there and see if we can prove it by looking at some trawls. So one of those studies is the longfin smelt distribution study. And we were lucky enough to be awarded a Prop 1 grant. That's a pretty competitive grant, and we're very happy that we're able to get that. And that's going to help us work with our partners and collaborators out there in the Delta, especially this year. It's a very wet year. We want to be able to take advantage of what we're seeing here, especially since the wet years tend to correlate with higher abundance. And we're going to get a lot better signal, understand the distribution in the water column a lot better. We're going to be doing trawls that allow us to understand what depths these longfin are. And hopefully we can get your support in July for board action. So the smelt cam, this is something that we've been investing in as well, both hardware and software. And what the smelt cam works, it's basically attached to a trawl. And what you do is you take this trawl, you drag it along the water, and the smelt cam, which is here over on the left, you attach it to the end. The fish then travel through the apparatus. A photo is taken, and then you get images like this. This is pretty nice images. They're not all like that, but we got the best ones for you guys. So this is adult smelt and a threadfin shad. And with that information, we can actually gather where they were in the water column and help us understand those correlations we're looking at and help us understand and interpret the survey data. That's very key to understanding what is happening to these fish. And it actually helps with take. Most trawls, when the fish are going in there, they're considered dead. And with this apparatus, it's much lower, much better. A lot of the fish tend to freely and more safely pass through it with much less harm. And so it's a lot safer, a lot more environmentally friendly on the fish. Modeling is another area we're going to be investing in. It's helpful to understand the predictions of where the fish can be located, longfin smelt, and how they respond to management. Modeling is key in that to make those kind of predictions. And we're going to be calibrating those models using a lot of remote sensing data as well as other long-term data. For example, we are working with Jet Propulsion Lab, trying to use their remote sensing data. Here's an example of their flyover data. This was published in 2015, showing Sassoon Bay. So if you remember, San Francisco Bay was over here, and then the Sassoon Bay. This is part of the range of longfin smelt, and we can see this is just turbidity. So all that sediment and dirt in the water as it's circulating in the water. With this flyover data, they can actually see those patterns. And that's really important because if we find that longfin smelt like this gradient right here, or they like these edges over here, that can help with habitat restoration. For example, Tule Red's right here. That's our restoration area. And if we can target our restoration there and we find that longfin are there and correlates with a lot of other factors, that can help us understand how effective our restoration is going to be. And it can be used for adaptive management because this data can be fed into models, allow us to do these predictions, run the study, implement it, and then do it again, and it'll help us further our efforts along the way. So in summary, the importance of our research is that our findings have found that a lot of these longfin smelt are spawning in brackish water, a lot more than had previously thought. It was thought it was more fresh water, and then they were advecting down into the brackish water zone. We're seeing a lot more local production in the brackish water. That's important because restoration can be targeted there, and it does have us more dependence on more local flows. It will have an effect on delta outflow, but more local flows will also be key. And how the fish are behaving in the water, where they are in that water column, is going to be important to understanding the survey data. If they are too low in the water column, such as the midwater trawl, the station is just too deep, that midwater trawl can just pass right over them, not know they're there. Also, if the water is too clear, it could pass right by them, the fish avoid the trawl, and they could have been there the whole time. This research has been very helpful for our collaborative efforts, working with state and federal agencies, as well as research institutes and our consultants. And we hope to be able to use this for adaptive management purposes, for flow management and restoration. And that's the end. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything on longfin smelt in our research. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. So aside from the fact that I forgot to shut off my cell phone, this was really just an outstanding piece of work, and it's really important to help us understand the impact of what we do in the Delta on endangered species, and this kind of science is very, very important to us. And so we'll take some questions. Director De Jesus.
Thank you. I'd like to echo the chairman's comments, Doctor, but I do have a question. I thought I was following along really well, and your presentation certainly helped me a lot to understand that. But in slide number 8, you gave us some information regarding some issues that have reduced the population since 1989. Mm-hmm. And yet your study shows how well they can grow and also where they do their best spawning, if you will.
Sure.
You also told us that there was a location that you found them to be growing in that previously you indicated, or someone indicated, that was improbable. So what I gather from this, and I need you to fill the gap here, is that they're adapting, they're moving. They're willing to survive elsewhere. So either they're going to relocate along the coast more than in the delta, if you will, and grow there because you don't have the issues that we see here, or they're just going to go extinct. And so I'm trying to kind of grapple with, what is it that we can really do other than to throw a lot of money into this and still have these, a clam fest, if you will.
So as for the South Delta, it's more a case of unlikely. It's been understood in U.S. Fish and Wildlife's documents that spawning down there is possible. It's just highly unlikely. It doesn't mean that it won't happen. They think under these really high flow years it's possible. We're still surprised by how much spawning had occurred there. So it was sort of a marginal habitat, but seems to be a lot more important in these high flow years like this year. When it comes to distribution, that was something I didn't really key on too much. So there's abundance and distribution. So abundance, that's the number of fish out there, right? And the distribution is how far into the San Francisco Bay estuary are they? Are they all the way in, up into the San Joaquin, Sacramento, or are they just occupying that more ocean-like area? Where are they exactly? Well, we know that they like to spawn in more lower salinity waters, so they're going to be dependent on these estuaries. Where else they can be found is in the ocean, so they can be distributed there. Are they going to adapt? Well, it's believed that they actually are sort of opportunistic, where instead of more like a salmon, where a salmon needs to go at a certain spot, it's possible these fish like areas that if the opportunity arises, where, like, let's say in San Pablo Bay, which is the north part of San Francisco Bay, that the habitat becomes fresher because of increased outflows out of Petaluma. Let's say that becomes fresher. Now that presents an opportunity for longfin smelt to spawn, and that allows it for that. For increasing salinities in the San Francisco estuary, that would start beginning to exclude them unless those kind of managements could happen. But on top of that, not only do we need those flows, we actually need the habitat to exist. So let's say you had increased flows out of Galenas Creek or something a little bit more westward, but the habitat there just wasn't going to work for longfin smelt. So you can have increased flows, lower salinity, but it just wasn't going to work. So you need both, that lower salinity area plus the habitat.
Okay, so it's just a follow-up. Should we be more concerned about salinity and flows or the clams and the organisms?
So the clams really caused a huge step change in their distribution. So they don't seem to be out there in Sassoon Bay as much as they used to be. From what I've looked at, clam management is going to be, I haven't seen any successful implementation of the clams. So the investment we're going to have to kind of carry out is that we're sort of have to be forced into salinity management and restoration management, because the clams, it doesn't mean you can't try, it's just that clam management has not been successful.
Okay, I don't mean to belabor this, but what you're really saying is in order to deal with the clams, which we can't, is to dump more water and control salinity.
No, I think we need to have more of a broad plan looking at salinity both in local tributaries and restoration. Because you can put flow in the system, but if there's no habitat for them, it's not going to help. And it can't just be delta outflow. It has to be the local tributaries as well.
Thank you. So I saw two arms up there. Director McKinney, I think, was next, and Director Barbary and Director Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. It's also about distribution, and you've alluded to the fact that the fish may be occurring in the ocean. Maybe they're more opportunistic. I was just curious whether we know what is happening with regard to the occurrence of these fish in the other estuaries and the rest of their range, all the way up to Alaska. Are those habitats preserved, or is there a trend that we're seeing there?
They're not as well known, unfortunately. Their surveys there are much more intimate, much more special, like meaning a couple years at best, or maybe 3 years, or they happen to intermittently capture them in another survey, so what they weren't intending to look at longfin, but they have and they have not collected them throughout the years. So it's hard to piece that together like it has within the Delta. The San Francisco Bay estuaries, it has a very unique operation there where it happens to have a very intense fisheries management system, as well as the surveys. There's a lot of surveys in there, a lot more long-lasting surveys than a lot of other areas. So they don't have the same kind of scope and trends. We haven't really seen that too much in those intermittent data when they piece them together, that these declines, they seem to be more on the southern range. But there's a lot of uncertainty in that relationship because they don't have the same annual index that we have with the longfin here.
So is it a fair comment to note that while we certainly are putting a high priority on making sure species don't go extinct, that this question that we're talking about today is more about the viability of a particular habitat and not the health of the species, because we just don't know?
So the distinct population segment has been given to the longfin smelt. That's the designation for the longfin smelt in San Francisco estuary. So they're trying to, our U.S. Fish and Wildlife is listing that segment for protection. The other parts, those are not being listed.
Is that a genetic distinction?
That's right now it's being a geographic distinction. But genetic work is being done to see whether that is viable as a genetic distinction. Some preliminary work is being promoted now. I think there was a presentation in Missoula a couple months back on that.
Okay, thank you.
Director Barber?
Director McKinney was channeling my thoughts exactly and my questions, which was, do we know the impacts in the other areas, and are the feds just doing a listing based on just the Bay Delta? So, and I guess the answer is yes. They're focusing just on that, not the rest of the country. So.
Well, the focus, it might be because of the intensity of the surveys.
Or the intensity of litigation. That could help, too.
I can't answer that. I have no idea.
I'm just suggesting.
It's always there.
But there is a lot more intensity in surveys in the southern range than they are in the upper ranges.
Director Hogan?
Well, fortunately, McKinney's channeling to Barbara's channel to me. Those are my questions with regards to the habitat.
Well, thank you. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thanks again, Sean. That was really very well done. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Hold on, Sean.
That's fine, Sean. There's a couple of folks here I want to introduce that are Sean's partners in crimes here
sorry.
that I see sitting over here in the front row. They work for ICF International, and that's Lenny Grimaldo. Dr. Grimaldo, formerly Fish and Wildlife Service, has done a ton of work in this area. He's now a consultant to Metropolitan assisting on this. You saw his name on one of the slides. And then he doesn't leave town without a lawyer with him, I guess, because Greg Wilkinson is here, which I think many of you know Greg. He's a water attorney that's been involved not only in California issues, but national issues. He sued me on more than one occasion successfully. So, anyway, glad you guys made it down.
Well, as long as we're doing audience introductions, I also wanted to note that Maria Moranian of the Regional Water Board is here, and good to see you, Maria, and Dwayne Georgeson, former Assistant General Manager at Met's here. So glad everyone's interested in our meetings. Thanks.
Well, we're being visited by lots of really important people in this topic. Moving right along, we're going to go on to committee item 3B, which is an update on California Water Fix by Steve Arakawa. And I want to point out one of the items that Steve's going to talk about is the approval of the biological opinions, the two federal biological opinions. And I don't know how many of you read the Los Angeles Times this morning. There was an article on the approval of the biological opinions in the Los Angeles Times. The facts were correct. You might have some quarrels with the interpretation, but the facts were really very positive. Steve, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So this is my update on Cal Water Fix for this month, and towards the end of my remarks, I'll certainly talk about the process we have in front of us as the board deliberates over Cal Water Fix. I want to touch on the decision process that we've been in the middle of, including the EIR, EIS, and the biological opinions. I want to talk a bit about where the State Water Resources Control Board is in their proceedings regarding the change in point of diversion for supporting a water right permit for Cal Water Fix. And then I want to talk about cost allocation. So those are the topics I want to go over in this report. This diagram here is a chart of the key decisions. And starting in this summer, which is where we're at, a number of things happening. As we move into the fall, then I'm showing a Corps of Engineers permit towards the end of that year, or maybe into early 2018. And then in 2018, the State Water Board's change in point of diversion decision. But I wanted to talk a bit about the decisions we have in 2017, and particularly what we have right in front of us. So yesterday was announced a key milestone, probably the most significant milestone with regard to Cal Water Fix to date, which is the issuance of the biological opinions to support Cal Water Fix for both the Delta smelt and the salmon. And the biological opinions provided a no jeopardy opinion, which means that the proposed action would not negatively affect the future viability of the species or the future existence of the species, nor adversely modify its habitat. So that's important to move forward with the project and understand how the project would need to be managed. And there was a variety of media areas covering the announcement yesterday. I'm sure you've seen some of them. But I think key is that the fish agencies were involved in portraying what was involved with their decision on the biological opinions. The next key area is the environmental impact report and impact statement. And so that's the second box that's on this chart. And under the California Environmental Quality Act, the state would make a decision regarding the environmental impact report for Cal Waterfix. And it would certify that it complies with the California Environmental Quality Act. It would adopt a mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and it would adopt other findings regarding the impacts of the project. And once the state takes that action, it would then issue a project order that approves the project as a component of the state water project. So that's the kind of decision that's related to the state's environmental impact report and the California Environmental Quality Act. There also is a National Environmental Policy Act action, the Environmental Impact Statement. And as you probably know, the Environmental Impact Report and Impact Statement was a combined document, but there would be some separate actions by the federal agency, Department of Interior, and Reclamation regarding the Environmental Impact Statement. And so those are both in front of us. And we're looking for those kinds of actions to move the project forward. What follows after that would be the California Endangered Species Act, what's called Section 2081. It's a code, Water Code Section 2081 permit, and that covers the state-listed species, salmon, longfin smelt, delta smelt, and that would follow shortly after the approval under the EIR. And then another regulatory process is the state providing certification that the Cal Waterfix project is consistent with the Delta Plan and providing that certification to the Delta Stewardship Council. I show this under summer 2017. It could be a certification that happens sooner rather than later. It's a little unclear when the state plans to forward that on, but that's another action that's a part of the whole process. And then it would be the state through DWR certifying that's consistent with the Delta Plan. Then it would be up to the Stewardship Council to identify whether there are any appeals to that certification of consistency. If there are appeals, then that would trigger an appeal process within the Stewardship Council's procedures. So those are some of the key things that we have. Wanted to talk a bit about the California Waterfix petition for the additional point of diversion on the Sacramento River for Cal Waterfix. And that process has been divided into two parts. We've talked about it in previous committee meetings. Part one deals with potential injury to other users of water, other legal water users. Those kinds of impacts deal with things like water quality, water levels, water supply in the system, and the water right holders that count on those things. And then part two is dealing with fish and wildlife, potential impacts to fish and wildlife, and consideration of what kinds of flow requirements and such that would be part of the Cal Waterfix decision. The kind of species that are being protected through this decision include delta smelt, longfin smelt, green sturgeon, and different runs of Chinook salmon. Where the State Water Board is on this process is back in July of 2016, they initiated the Part 1 process. They're pretty much at the close of Part 1. They've been, in the last couple of weeks, they've been in what's called SIR rebuttal process, and that's like rebuttal to the rebuttal. And so parties put on direct testimony, then there's rebuttal that parties are able to provide, and cross-examination for both the direct and the rebuttal. And then there's SIR rebuttal that allows for parties to come back in and clarify things that were identified in rebuttal. So there's about another day of that to complete the process of SIR rebuttal. There's a 2-week break right now, and that day we expect to happen in the middle of July. And then once that happens, then the State Water Board will determine how closing briefs would be filed, and then following the approval of the EIR-EIS, then the State Water Board would have a decision on when to initiate Part 2, because the biological opinions and the EIR are part of what they were waiting for in order to initiate Part 2 of the proceedings at the State Water Board. I wanted to talk a bit about cost allocation. Discussions and efforts continue on that, both in terms of how costs would be allocated between the state and the federal water project contractors, and then also how those costs for each of those would be allocated within that group. So we've been talking to you along the lines of 45% allocated to the Central Valley project contractors that are going to be investing in the project, 55% that would be the state share through the State Water Project. And then on the State Water Project side, we've talked to you about how the allocation would work. It would be an allocation based on the existing provisions in the State Water Project contract. That is, in the state project contract, there's called what's Table A contract amount. Metropolitan is about 47% of that contract amount. Kern County Water Agency, for example, is a little under 25% of that contract amount, and then there's various other contractors that have portions. And so the cost of Cal Water Fix would be based on those terms in the contract. Essentially, the water benefits would be tied to the costs, so you would be paying for the investment based on the water supply provided and the benefits that are provided, consistent with the State Water Project contract. So those are that is still the approach that's being pursued. A lot of the recent work has been on the finer details of how all of that would work, including how contractors could have the opportunity to manage their supply with other contractors through exchanges or transfers. And so that kind of detail is being worked out or focused on. And on the CVP side, similarly, they're having conversations between themselves and determining how the investors and those that are not part of the export area that counts on the project or will not count on the project, how they will deal with that. There's been talks with the state on how the cost allocation discussions have been going, and how the contractors will be planning to support the project based on that cost allocation and that commitment. So those are still going on, and we'll be updating you on that. And certainly that will be a key feature of white paper number 3 when we move forward with that. So that pretty much finishes my report for the day. I'm just flashing up a slide here that shows what our process is as far as the white papers and the board workshop and the board action, recognizing that there may be some refinements to that based on the chair and the general manager determining how things might work, and just wanted to make sure that you continue to see how the process is defined right now, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Director Steiner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the BIOPS in, would it be safe to say that your conversations concerning the cost allocation may speed up now, so that when we get to the white paper that's referenced there for the finance in August, that we will be dealing with actual agreement or agreement in concept versus assumptions which we've been making? Would that be a correct assumption on my part.
I'll take a crack at that. The answer is yes.
Although he's looking.
Oh, you're looking for Jeff?
But I'd like to
You
hear
were,
Roger's crack.
you were avoiding the look.
He can correct me.
And then I'll correct him.
What we're planning to have in that white paper is essentially the term sheets of the cost allocation. What we won't know is who the participants are on the CVP side. We will know how it's going to work, but their decision on participation will actually come in September when they make consideration. But we will have the term sheets of how it will work. That's what we're hoping for.
And then mentioning CVP, there was an article about a letter that was sent by various Northern and Central California agencies to the Bureau saying that, and I may be incorrectly paraphrasing it, but that they're not interested in paying for the tunnels and they don't want to lose any water, and they're seeking assurances, as one might expect, that they in fact would not be paying for anything or having any diminishment of their water. And so is that part of what you're talking about the CVP still wandering around?
I don't believe that it is. I think the reclamation has essentially, from what I've heard, acknowledged that this is the way it needs to be. If you're not getting benefits, you shouldn't pay. Okay. There are mitigation measures for the entire project that we're dealing with now under the biological opinions, which they do distribute out to the entirety of their contractors. So I think that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is having them on the CVP side describe the methodology for participation by CVP contractors in Cal Water Fix and how that will work and under what terms.
And then finally, the issue that we have talked about of if we have an agency or a participant in the state contractors who is not interested in this and is going to assert that they have dual conveyance rights. That discussion is still going on as to what their rights might be to water if they choose not to participate. Would that be correct?
Well, I guess I would describe it this way. As Steve said, we, DWR, with working with the state contractors, we envision taking our share of the project and distributing it out proportionate to all of our contractors except north of the Delta. All of our contracts proportionate to Table A. And then allow the mechanisms that are provided for in the contracts if someone wants to reduce their costs and is willing to accept less reliability, they find an arrangement with another contractor, which is what happens now. So that is the model that we're using on the state side, which doesn't take a contract amendment to do that.
End of my questions.
One last caveat on that is, in the white paper, it'll be what the contractors have discussed amongst themselves and proposed arrangements. And that would be what we'd be bringing to the board with recommendations from GMs of all the agencies. Obviously, none of us can entirely predict how the board will react to those recommendations, and the results may be different than the recommendations, but all we can do is bring to you what the plan is, and then we'll have to see how every agency votes, and we'll be reporting back to the board how people reacted to that proposal.
I have Director Morris and Director McKinney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Roger, could you give us an estimate as to, in terms of percent of flow for each State Water Project and Central Valley Project contractors, what percentage are still totally vested in the program? Seriously?
Well, let me flip it around. I haven't heard anyone make any final decision that they're not vested in the program. Okay. This is what is sorting. This is what
other than Napa and Sonoma, right, and Butte.
Director McKinney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Roger, you may already have answered this, or you may not want to answer it. I'm not sure which, but we're envisioning the project always being dual conveyance. So are we thinking that the part that's going to come through the tunnels is what people are going to either opt into or opt out of, but to the extent that if somebody didn't participate in the tunnels, that what they get across the delta is still going to be divided by Table A?
On the state side, we're not looking at an opt-in or an opt-out approach. The approach is everybody's going to be allocated their share, and then if you want to change the distribution of that because of economic impacts and you're willing to accept less reliability, then you'll do a Table A transfer or some other kind of arrangement with someone else. So all of the state contractors would be involved, and their entitlement to the total water supply would be proportionate to their Table A.
But then everybody has to pay their share.
Absolutely.
For that deal.
Right. But you could have someone say, I'm willing to, I don't want to take on a certain amount of this additional cost. I'm willing to give up a certain amount of reliability proportionate to that. Is there another state contractor willing to pick up the extra cost and increase their reliability further? So that's the transfer mechanism.
Let me provide a concrete example. You're probably aware Metropolitan has an arrangement with the Coachella Valley Water District where we have transferred 100,000 acre-feet of Table A to them. They pay for it. We have a callback right. When we need the water and want to put it in storage, we call it back and then we pay for it. So that's a way that they get more water reliability. We get cost relief, and we've made that arrangement. There's other such arrangements out there.
Well, I think my question is probably simpler than all that. I just wanted to understand that. I think this is probably part of what Director Steiner is getting at is, well, I'll continue to be confused and you can enlighten me. But I just want to make sure we're not going to get in a situation where a bunch of people say we're going to pay for these tunnels because it improves reliability, and somebody in the group says, I don't want to pay for that. But you guys get your water through the tunnel, and then the water that comes across the delta, I'll get that because you already got yours, and I'll get mine without paying for the tunnels. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. So.
I have Director Steiner again.
Yes,
and
so to take that last thought, you're going to have your Table A, and you're going to decide how much of it you want, and it's either going to come through the dual conveyance or the tunnel, but that's all you're going to get if you choose not to pay for your share of the tunnel. In essence, wherever that water comes from, you're just going to get that percentage of your, would that be right? Because you can't have it so that I only get water through the dual conveyance and I'm not going to get water through the tunnel. I just don't envision how that's going to work.
Can I address that in some way?
Steve,
So the way the contractors have been talking about Cal Water Fix is it's an integral part of the existing state water project. So it would be an added facility to the state water project, and it would be up to DWR to operate that whole system. So there's not Cal Water Fix water and then base state project water.
do we have any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
The next item is the Bay Delta Managers Report. Roger, you're up.
Well, I got a few good news items I want to continue to talk about today. I mentioned that. Well, it's only been 11 years. I've got to enjoy these times when they come. So, Steve mentioned the biological opinions. That's a major milestone, obviously, to get both opinions with no jeopardy and no adverse mod. Those are kind of the keys to being able to move forward on our decision process. The other thing last week, the Delta Stewardship Council did adopt the proposed amendments to the Delta Plan for storage, conveyance, and operations. That was a positive move in our view. We had a really good turnout from Southern California to come up and talk to the committee. Steve was there for us, and many others from the water and business community down here that showed up. You mentioned Brenda Berman. She has been announced as the intent to nominate for Commissioner of Reclamation. Most of you know Brenda, know her well. She worked at Metropolitan. She's now in Arizona with the Salt River Project. Before she came to Met, she worked for Nature Conservancy. She worked in Interior, both in Reclamation and in the Assistant Secretary's Office for Water and Science. I think when I first met her, she was the water person for Senator Kyle from Arizona. So she has a broad, very, very extensive experience, and I'm really pleased to see this nomination. So that's good. The one other thing, this is going to be a little bit of a video here. I'll give you a little background on this. This is on Butte Creek, and going back a while to the mid-1990s when the Bay Delta Accord was struck then, and Secretary was Bruce Babbitt at the time. I was involved in that as I was working for the Department of Interior. But one of the ideas that the water user community pushed was that we can't just do everything that we believe we need to do for fish with flow only. This probably sounds familiar. We need to make investments in habitat and non-flow kinds of things. And so when the deal was cut, Secretary Babbitt said, well, somebody's got to pony up some money. We need more than just talk. We need somebody to put some cash on the barrelhead to start funding some of these non-flow things. And so the secretary called the general manager of Metropolitan Water District and said, I'd like for you to commit $30 million to this, quote, Category 3. It's the third category. And Metropolitan has always stepped up and put $30 million out there. And one of the first projects that was invested in was on Butte Creek. And I think Metropolitan committed about $6 million to go into Butte Creek, which at the time had like 10 diversion dams on it. And the spring run salmon, that's primarily spring run, they couldn't make their way up Butte Creek. So I was actually out and I handed the 16-pound sledge to Secretary Babbitt when he knocked the first diversion down on Butte Creek. And we had an event up there the week before last that Metropolitan participated in. And we've got about a 2-minute video that shows this. We spent about $6 million in Butte Creek in total. Metropolitan has, and it's been matched like 2 to 1, one from the locals and one from the federal agencies. So it's really been leveraged, and it's been successful. It's opened up about 37 miles now to spring run salmon. Very successful. And I think there's a graph in here of the population, which is kind of mind-boggling. So, okay, fired up.
Creek, which is a tributary off the Sacramento River. It's also a place that is celebrating 20 years of salmon recovery success.
We came to Butte Creek with the goal of restoring the ladders, fish screens, implementing in-stream flows, looking at putting adult exclusion barriers in to cut down on the strain, changing fishing regulations, and really put together a system-wide restoration plan to benefit fish. And immediately in 1998, we had 20,212 fish return. So almost as we started beginning the restoration, we were seeing response by fish.
The success is more than just about salmon. The success of this project centers around the fact that proactive leadership allowed people and organizations, often with differing interests, to come together to divert water for the benefit of not only the fish, but the farms and other species that coexist on the Pacific Flyway.
Southern California gets its water from different places, from the Colorado River, from Northern California, and we found that the best way to keep that water supply stable and functioning is to invest in the area where it comes from. So we invest up here at the source of that water. We invest in the environment, we invest in the people, and we invest in our relationships.
This is about cooperation. This is about bringing people together. It's a tough task in these times because all over this country we've tended to fragment, to come apart, to get into adversary positions. What we've got to do, and the instructive importance of this project is, we can make it working together, listening to each other, thinking carefully about the intersection of common interests, patient, intense, creative.
That's it.
Anything else? I do want to point one thing out, that the part 2 that the Water Board is going through on fish and wildlife, one of the species they're going to be looking at is the long-fin smelt, presumably depending heavily on what we heard at the beginning of this committee meeting. So I guess that's it for now. Follow-up items? Seeing none? Oh, sure.
Thank you, Director LaFay. I just wanted to make a comment about what's in front of us the next few months and the importance of trying to make all the meetings and preparing and being engaged. I know we've got things coming up like solar eclipses and you name it, but staff is working really hard, and we owe it to our ratepayers and also the investment that we have in this project to give it our all the next several months. We'll do everything we can to accommodate any needs that anyone has, but just wanted to put that out there. My good friend Glenn Peterson, who's been a director for 25 years, somehow forgot that there were committee meetings twice a month. So I'm going to take Glenn under my wing and work on that. So, I mean, you know I'm kidding. You know how much I like Glenn. So anyway, look forward to this process. I mean, this is what we've been working for. So let's step up and be a big part of it.
I understand we're to get the first white paper in the very near future, so that should be a really important time. And let's see, the last thing is future agenda items. Seeing none, we're adjourned.